The Arizona sun blazed high as Zach Norris swung open the door to a dusty Goodwill store. The scent of second-hand books, worn-out clothes, and forgotten furniture filled the air. Today's mission was simple. Find a used golf pushcart, nothing more, nothing less. Zach wasn't a stranger to thrift stores. Over the years, he had developed an eye for spotting hidden gems among discarded trinkets, though he never considered himself an expert. Occasionally, he'd come across an old camera or a rare vinyl record worth flipping for a few extra bucks. But today, his mind was set on golf, his latest weekend obsession. As he weaved through aisles of mismatched furniture and shelves overflowing with kitchenware, he couldn't help but let his curiosity wander. He knew the best finds often came when least expected. That's when his eyes landed on a small basket near the checkout counter. A tangle of old wristwatches, plastic straps intertwined with tarnished metal bands. Zach hesitated. Watches weren't his thing, but there was always that nagging feeling. What if something valuable lay hidden beneath the heap of scratched faces and broken clasps? On a whim, he reached in, sifting through the pile. A cheap digital watch, a gaudy gold-toned piece with missing links, a child's cartoon watch with a faded superhero on its face. Then his fingers brushed against something different, a leather strap, worn but intact, a stainless steel case with an aged patina, subtle yet distinguished. He picked it up, flipping it over. The name Le Coultre was etched on the back. He didn't recognize it immediately, but something about the watch felt old, special. The price tag attached to it, $5.99. Zach's pulse quickened. Could this be something rare, or was it just another forgotten relic, long past its prime? Shoving aside his skepticism, he made a quick decision. He tucked the watch under his arm, paid for his haul, and walked out the door, completely unaware that his life was about to change. The watch felt heavier than expected as Zach Norris stepped into his car, setting it on the passenger seat. He glanced at it again under the Arizona sun, its faded dial and worn leather strap catching the light in a way that hinted at something different. Le Coultre. He repeated the name in his head, trying to place it. It sounded familiar, but where had he heard it before? He wasn't a watch collector. He had no idea if this was a name of prestige or just another forgotten brand that had faded into obscurity. Still, something about the watch nagged at him. Instead of heading straight home, he took a detour. Pulling into the parking lot of a nearby coffee shop, he grabbed his phone, fingers tapping quickly as he searched the name Le Coultre Deep Sea Alarm. The first result nearly made his heart stop. The watch, staring back at him from his phone screen, looked nearly identical to the one resting on his passenger seat. But there was one massive difference: the price. $25,000 to $40,000 estimated value, read the auction listing from a luxury watch dealer. Zach blinked. He must have misread it. He checked again, scrolling through multiple sources, each confirming the same shocking truth. This was no ordinary timepiece. It was a Jaeger Le Coultre Deep Sea Alarm, an ultra-rare dive watch made in the 1950s, and he had just bought one for $6. His heart pounded. Could it really be the same watch? It looked the same, but maybe it was a replica, a fake? There was only one way to find out. He needed an expert. Pulling out of the parking lot, he made a sharp turn, heading toward the one place he knew could give him answers: a high-end watch dealer in town. The next hour would determine whether he had just stumbled upon the deal of a lifetime, or if he was chasing an illusion. Zach's hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than usual as he drove across town. The thought raced through his mind: Could this really be real? His logical side told him not to get his hopes up. People found cheap knockoffs all the time. But deep down, a tiny voice kept whispering, "What if?" He pulled into the parking lot of a well-known watch dealer, a place he had passed 100 times but never had a reason to enter. Today, that changed. The bell above the door chimed as he stepped inside. The shop was small but elegant. Polished glass cases filled with Rolexes, Omegas, and vintage Patek Philippes. Behind the counter stood an older man with silver hair, a magnifying loupe resting over one eye. "Can I help you?" the man asked, glancing at Zach with mild curiosity. Zach took a breath and carefully pulled the watch from his pocket, placing it on the counter. "I found this at a thrift store," he said. "I was wondering if you could take a look." The man arched an eyebrow but reached for the watch, his movements slow and precise. As he turned it over in his hands, something changed in his expression. His casual demeanor stiffened. His eyes narrowed, the loupe quickly flipping down over his eye as he examined the watch more closely. For a few tense moments, the shop was silent, except for the faint ticking of a nearby grandfather clock. Then the man set the watch down carefully, exhaling through his nose. "Where did you say you found this?" His voice was calm, but there was something behind it. Something careful, controlled. Zach swallowed. "At a Goodwill store. I paid $6 for it." The old man let out a short, incredulous chuckle. "You, my friend, may have just made the find of the decade." Zach felt his pulse spike. "So, it's real?" The watchmaker nodded slowly. "Not just real. This is a La Cultra deep-sea alarm, one of the rarest vintage dive watches ever made. They only produced about 1,000 of these for the American market in the late 1950s. He tapped the crystal lightly. This is museum-worthy." Zach's mind spun. He had walked into a Goodwill looking for a golf cart and walked out with a piece of history. But before he could process it all, the watchmaker leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "If I were you, I'd be careful who you tell about this." Zach's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" The man's gaze stayed locked on him, a flicker of something serious in his expression. "Because once word gets out, everyone is going to want this watch." Zach felt a chill crawl up his spine despite the warm Arizona air outside. "Everyone?" he echoed. The watchmaker folded his arms, giving Zach a look that made it clear this was no ordinary discovery. "You have something incredibly rare," the man said. "Collectors, dealers, even auction houses, they'd all be interested. Some will play fair, others won't." Zach's grip tightened on the edge of the glass counter. "So, what do I do?" The man exhaled, tapping a finger on the watch as if weighing his words. "First, don't go flashing this around. You got lucky. No one else at that Goodwill recognized what you had, but the wrong person could have." He paused. "Second, you need to get this authenticated by a reputable expert, someone who can confirm its legitimacy in writing. If it's real, and from what I see it is, you're looking at a watch worth tens of thousands of dollars." Zach felt his throat go dry. He had read about rare garage sale finds and hidden treasures at flea markets, but he never imagined he'd be the one holding something that could change his life overnight. He slipped the watch back into his pocket, suddenly hyper-aware of his surroundings. Was anyone else watching him? Listening? He knew it sounded paranoid, but the weight of the watch in his pocket felt heavier than before. "Who would you recommend?" he asked. The watchmaker scribbled a name and number on a small business card. "There's a collector in California, Eric Q. He's one of the biggest vintage watch experts out there. If anyone can authenticate this properly, it's him." Zach nodded, tucking the card into his wallet. And if it's real? The man smiled knowingly. Then you just turned $6 into a small fortune. Zach thanked him and walked out, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. His heart pounded as he slid into his car. The next steps had to be careful, deliberate. He wasn't just holding a watch anymore. He was holding an opportunity, one that could slip away just as fast as it had appeared. Taking a deep breath, he pulled out his phone and dialed the number. The call rang once, then twice. A voice answered. "Yeah, this is Eric." Zach hesitated for just a second before speaking. "I think I have something you might want to see." Zach sat in his parked car, gripping his phone with sweaty palms. "This is Eric," the voice repeated, waiting. Zach took a breath. "I've found a LeCultre deep-sea alarm watch," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I picked it up at a Goodwill for, well, $6. Silence. Then a small chuckle. "You're joking." "I wish I was," Zach said. "But I had it looked at by a local watchmaker. He said it's the real deal." Eric's tone shifted. "Send me pictures. Good ones. Close-ups of the dial, the case back, any markings." Zach fumbled with his phone, snapping photos of every angle and emailing them over. A minute later, the response came. Not a written reply, but a call. Zach answered. Eric's voice was different this time, sharper. "Where did you say you got this?" "A thrift store in Phoenix," Zach said. "You're sitting on something big," Eric said bluntly. "A real deep-sea alarm is incredibly rare, especially in original condition. If your watch checks out, you're looking at $30,000 to $40,000, maybe more." Zach exhaled slowly. The number still didn't feel real. "I need to see it in person," Eric continued. "Are you willing to sell?" Zach hesitated. The idea of holding on to it, keeping it as some legendary find, crossed his mind. But the truth was, he could use the money. His wedding was coming up, and this could change everything. "How soon?" Zach asked. "I'll fly out tomorrow," Eric said. "If this is real, I'll buy it on the spot." Zach's mind raced. This was happening fast. He had expected weeks of back and forth, but now a high-profile watch dealer was flying in just for him. He barely slept that night. Every sound outside made him paranoid. What if someone somehow found out? What if it was stolen before he could sell it? By morning, he was exhausted, but the excitement kept him running on adrenaline. By noon, he was sitting in a cafe, staring at the door. Then Eric walked in, a sharp-dressed man, confident, carrying an expert's air. He sat down, wasted no time. "Let's see it." Zach carefully unwrapped the watch, setting it on the table between them. Eric picked it up, examined it, ran a finger across the dial, then he smiled. "This," he said, "is the real thing." Zach barely had time to process the words before Eric reached into his bag, pulling out something unexpected, a small stack of crisp $100 bills. $35,000, Eric said. "Cash, right now." Zach stared at the money, then at the watch in Eric's hand. It was time to make a decision. The cafe air felt heavy as Zach stared at the stacks of cash in front of him. $35,000. He could hear his own heartbeat. Eric held the watch in one hand, the other resting casually on the briefcase of money. "This is a fair offer," he said. "It's in great condition, and I have collectors lined up. But if you want to hold out for an auction, you might get more." The words hung in the air. Zach swallowed. He had never held this much money at once, never imagined that a random trip to Goodwill would lead him here. But the money, it was real, tangible, no waiting, no risks. Still, A part of him hesitated. Was this the right move? Then he thought about his wedding. His fiancée, Leandra, had been saving every penny. They were planning something simple, something small. 35 grand? That changed everything. Zach exhaled slowly. We have a deal. Eric nodded, sliding the cash toward him. Zach reached out, the bills cool under his fingers. His hand shook slightly, not from nerves, but from the sheer unbelievability of it all. Eric carefully wrapped the watch in a cloth, placing it inside a leather case. You made a hell of a find, my friend. Zach let out a small laugh, still in shock. No kidding. As Eric stood to leave, he paused. You got lucky, but remember, luck favors those who keep their eyes open. You never know where the next big find might be. Zach nodded, shaking his hand. Then, as Eric walked away, he sat there for a long time, staring at the money. $6 had just turned into 35,000, and just like that, his life was changed. He picked up his phone and dialed Leandra. You're not going to believe this, he said, grinning. The end. Blast off.